Hello everyone, it's Mr. Moomaw again, welcoming you back to American History, lecture number 4, Prelude to the Revolution. Hello, Miss Hahn, Miss McCall, nice to see you again. I'm not really seeing you, but you're seeing me, so hello anyway. Today we're going to be talking about the end of a relationship, a long-term relationship between the American colonies and the government back in Britain. What's important to understand about this, I think what's interesting to understand about this, is how quickly it all really just falls apart. I mean, you're talking about the end of Pontiac's War. Well, the end of French Indian War, 1763. End of Pontiac's War, 1767. Not even 9 years later, 1776, the United States declares its independence. Congress sends the Declaration of Independence off, and there you go. So events really just get out of control as far as the British government is concerned within that 9-year span of time. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How things fell apart, why they fell apart, and what the consequences were of those things falling apart. Spoiler alert, it's the American Revolution. So, building up to that, let's begin. 1763, things are looking great for Britain. Looks really strong, looks really powerful, because it's basically in control, as you can see, we've seen this map before, as you can see, it's in control of most of North America. Over here, you have Louisiana controlled by Spain, but Spain, remember, is declining. Spain's going down. So really what you're left with is one big, massive power over here, one power in decline. It looks like the future is British. For the colonies, however, it's not looking that great. Remember, the people in the colonies want to move west. They want to move into these new lands as far as they're concerned. They've gotten rid of the French. As far as they're concerned, their militia is what drove the French off. That's not the position of the British government. There's this divergence. The British government thinks of the colonies, essentially, we're going to talk about mercantilism here in a second. They think of the colonies basically as a source of raw materials and a market for their goods. They don't really think of these colonies as having a kind of independent destiny, but really at this point, that's what they're developing. The people in the colonies realize that the government back in Britain, it isn't operating all the time in their best interest. Now, as to mercantilism. Dominant economic theory at the time in Britain is mercantilism. Mercantilism is a big, complicated subject. You take economics and you're a senior. Your economics teacher will explain it a little better. It's way more complicated than I'm making it sound. For our purposes, know that mercantilism is two things. One, the basic idea is a country should maximize exports and minimize imports. You should sell more than you're buying. That sounds pretty simple in basic economics. Here's where colonies fit into that scheme. Colonies are sources of raw materials, as mentioned before. Wood, wool, all that stuff. All that stuff gets produced in the colonies and sent back to the mother country. In the mother country, the wood and the iron and stuff like that is turned into clocks, manufactured goods. Those manufactured goods are then sold back to the colonies. The colonies function as a market for these manufactured goods. So in the scheme of things, the colonies aren't supposed to be producing manufactured goods. They're supposed to be producing raw materials, stuff like that. Which means your economy in the colonies can't really get that sophisticated. That's not to say that they're poor. There are countries today, like Australia. Australia is still mainly a raw material producing country. But in very high first world standard of living. All the same, though, it doesn't allow your economy to really grow. So not only are you bottling people up right there behind the Appalachian Mountains, you're also retarding their economic growth. So that really bothers people. Now, I didn't mention the guy's name yet. Probably ought to know it anyway. I didn't mention the guy's name yet. One of the reasons things end up kind of falling apart is the personalities of the people involved. You have at the very top of the heap King George III. One thing to remember about these British kings, going all the way back to 1066, Britain has been governed by lines of foreigners. William the Conqueror comes in from Normandy, takes over. William the Conqueror's line is replaced by the Plantagenet kings out of Anjou in the middle of France. The Plantagenets, in their turn, they die out. You end up with Lancaster and York, and eventually they get replaced by the Tudors, who are Welsh. The Tudors get replaced by the Stuarts, who are Scottish. And the Stuarts, when they finally die off, get replaced by the Hanoverians. After Queen Anne dies, Anne Stuart, they dust off their genealogy books and everything like that, and they say, oh, well, wait a minute, the nearest blood relative is this guy George, who's the king of Hanover, this little place in Germany. So they go to Hanover, they invite this guy to be king of England, he shows up, he doesn't even speak English. So George III dies, George II takes over, George II has a son, that son dies, and his grandson ends up taking over as George III. Bear in mind, at the same time these guys are king of England, they're also king of Hanover. Bear in mind, this guy is only a couple generations away from being just fully German. They aren't really integrated into the English system, and remember we talked about the English Bill of Rights, he's a constitutional monarch anyway. That's not to say he doesn't have a lot of pull. George III is technically still the head of state, and he still basically picks his advisors, picks his prime ministers and stuff like that. If Parliament picks him and sends him up, but the king doesn't approve of him, he doesn't get in. So the king tends to surround himself with people who agree with him. He doesn't have that firm a hold on England, or especially what's going on in the colonies. No British king or upper-level British government guy ever goes out to the colonies. So they don't have that firm of a command of the situation. They really don't understand what's going on. From George III, the king at the top, king during the American Revolution, all the way down to the bottom in England, there really isn't a good sense of how these policies are affecting the colonies or what the people in the colonies think. Mercantile is a great example of that. Now, we know one thing about wars, right? Wars are expensive. Wars are expensive. They cost a ton of money. And Parliament spent millions of pounds on this French and Indian War, which just went on forever. And then, of course, Pontiac's War went on forever. So at the end of all this, they borrow all this money from the Bank of England, and what do? How do you get that money back? Well, let's see, we need a revenue stream. I know, the colonies will tax them. They haven't been paying any taxes in a while. So just like the genealogy books, they go in, they dust off all their old law books, and wouldn't you know it, there was a tax in the colonies all along. It was a sugar tax. And sorry guys if I'm a little nasally, I got kind of a cold or something. I'm not exactly sure what's going on, so I'm a little off today. If I don't have my A game, I apologize, but I'm working through it. All right. So they have the Sugar Act. Well, actually, before this Molasses Act there. They already had a tax on sugar, basically. A tariff, an import tax. If you are manufacturing rum, I know you guys don't know anything about alcohol because you're too young, and you haven't seen commercials or anything, but rum is basically made out of molasses, which is from sugarcane. So if you want to import molasses, you want to import sugar, you're supposed to be paying the British government a tax, like 5 cents a pound. Problem is, nobody actually pays this tax. The problem, imagine, for example, you got a situation where they're paying me $200,000 a year to teach history. That'd be awesome, man, right? But see, that's so much money that if I were unscrupulous, I could actually pay someone $30,000 out of my salary to actually show up and do my job. I sit home and collect $170,000 a year for doing nothing. Now, the guy who only makes $30,000, that's not bad, because now he gets to collect bribes. You come up to him and bribe him $300, $400 here and there to give you A's and let you pass the class. So you're happy you got the A, he's happy he's got the bribes, and the guy back home is happy because he's collecting a salary for doing nothing. Now that works out for almost everybody, except the government that isn't collecting any money, and on top of that is paying all these people to do nothing. That's the situation you have here. Tax collectors, they sit back in England, they don't do anything, and they send their guys out with a modest chunk of their salary. Those guys in turn collect bribes from all the smugglers. Prominent sugar smugglers like John Hancock of Massachusetts made his fortune in sugar smuggling, among other things. So basically you have a situation where they got the tax on the books, nobody's paying it. It's cheaper to pay a 2 cent a pound bribe to a customs agent rather than the 5 cent a pound tax, or whatever. So, 1763, Parliament decides to pass the Sugar Act. And what the Sugar Act does, it lowers the tariff. It actually bumps it down from 5 cents a pound to 3 cents a pound. But it provides for strict enforcement. All of those tax collector guys now have to go out to the Caribbean, post up in Barbados, take careful stock of what's going out, go out to the colonies, actually collect the tax coming in. And the Royal Navy's out there also, making sure nobody's smuggling sugar back and forth. It's kind of funny to think of sugar being this like illegal trade or whatever. But yeah, sure. So this is widely resented. The Sugar Act hits a lot of very prominent people in the colonies right in their pocketbooks. And it's seen as something really intrusive. Yeah, it's been on the books forever, but because nobody paid it, nobody cared. Now they're actually enforcing it. People start to really look at this situation and say, we here in the colonies, we have always governed ourselves. From the very beginning, we had these charters. Sure, there are royal governors. There are governors appointed back, from back in Europe, but we have to pay them. We make our own legislatures. We pass our own laws. We raise our own militia. And we set our own tax rates. So what right does Britain really have to tax us? They have no previous role in our government, other than to send our royal governors and kind of stay back. Well, the Sugar Act keeps going. Nobody pays it still. It's incredibly easy to smuggle in sugar. You guys know you're on the coast, all the little islands and everything, all the inlets. I mean, if you're a local guy and you have a small boat, you can easily row out, grab sugar off a boat, and somebody drops it off, and just take it up a creek or whatever and send it wherever you want. I mean, it's completely ineffective. And this, like all these other taxes they passed that we're going to talk about, ends up costing them more than they actually ever collect. Now, the Sugar Act makes very prominent people mad, but of course not everybody in the colonies is involved with sugar activities. So it doesn't hit everybody at the same time and in the same way. The British, though, have a plan for screwing that up. The British government, hard on the heels of the Sugar Act, 1765, passes the Stamp Act. We'll collect money with that. What does the Stamp Act consist of? Well, basically, the Stamp Act is a tax on printed goods. You want to print a magazine, a newspaper, whatever, anything you're printing. You have to get a special stamp. They send out these tax collectors and the government stamps, and you stamp your paper with it, so when you paid the tax. That's what the tax looks like here. Shame on he who thinks evil of it. That's back medieval history. We'll talk about that later. But this is a tax on printed goods, and here's the thing about a tax on printed goods. We've talked about Ben Franklin, Apology for Printers. We've talked about how important these printers are, how they are the hub of information networks in the colonies and all that. Well, that's who you're making mad. That's who you now you've gone right into the hub of people who spread information everywhere, and you've angered them. Plus, everybody important who has anything to say, you've made them mad because now they have to pay a tax on anything they print. Sort of like if you were to pass a tax on angry blogs or something. Let's find the biggest, worst trolls on the internet and pay, troll tax, troll toll, whatever. Put a tax on that. Just makes people who are already mad and have nothing to do but complain even angrier. Well, with this, it makes everybody who has anything important to say mad. The Stamp Act is absolutely hated. And when I say hated, I mean these guys tax collectors are beaten up in the streets. This is a time, please understand, when people are much, much more comfortable with physical violence in public. Even very prominent people. Tax collectors would be beaten up, tarred and feathered, just say they have boiling tar poured over them, and then feathers thrown on them so the feathers stick, and you have to actually turpentine all that crap off you later. Ridden out of town on a rail where they tie you up hand and foot, put a rail between your legs and bounce you to the edge of town and throw you off, which, as you can imagine, doesn't feel very comfortable. So the Stamp Act really just creates this widespread, colonies-wide anger. In response to this, at the instigation of Ben Franklin, among others, all the different colonial legislatures formed these committees of correspondence, which is to say, each legislature sets up a permanent group within the legislature that does nothing but communicate with all the other legislatures. So they've got a constant network of news going through all these different legislatures. And understand how important this is. All of these colonies have much more in common before this with Britain. They're much more in contact with Britain than they are with each other. Now you're starting to see this shift where they start to unify and identify with each other as against the British government. And these tax issues are a big part of that. Oh, here's a great example of that in practice. You can see this guy here, he's a tax collector, he's been tarred and feathered. They're pouring tea down his throat, presumably hot tea. They're thuggish looking, this guy has a club. Over here it says Liberty Tree and has a noose hanging from it. So this is a British cartoon about these thuggish Americans running around doing all this stuff, beating up perfectly innocent tax collectors. Now, the Stamp Act doesn't work. It doesn't collect anything like the money it's supposed to collect. It costs way more to enforce. And of course, the tax collectors are getting savagely beaten in the streets. So now the British government does two things, both of which make the situation even worse. One, they rescind the Stamp Act in 1766. So they put a tax in, everybody gets beaten up, and a year later they just drop the issue. So clearly they're now in a position of weakness. However, in that position of weakness, they then put out the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act is basically Parliament saying, we in Parliament assert that we have the right to tax the colonies anytime we want for any reason we want. We have that authority. Parliament has never before clearly asserted that authority. And for the colonists, who are used to setting their own tax rates, this seems like a usurpation. This seems like them grabbing power that they don't really have, or at least have never had before. It's a threat to liberty. And at this point, you start to see this rhetoric. I mean, it's around there before. You start to see this rhetoric of no taxation without representation. We in the colonies are not represented in Parliament. Therefore, we shouldn't be taxed by Parliament. We're representing our local legislatures, so that counts. Parliament's response is something like, back in England, most people can't vote anyway. You have to have a certain amount of property to be able to vote, and in some areas, there are like 4 families that have that much property. So if all these people who can't vote are represented in Parliament, then you colonists who can't vote are represented in Parliament too. This doesn't go over very well, obviously, in the colonies. Hard on the heels of the Declaratory Act comes the Townshend Acts. It says Townshend, but it's Townsend. Now, the Townshend Acts are just another one of these little petty taxes, nails, paint, glue, whatever, all that. Little small, basically taxes a whole range of small articles. But the new innovation with the Townshend Acts is that now the British government sends over soldiers to enforce the collection of them. Not police or anything, these are combat soldiers. And they send them to what they consider the epicenter of this protest movement, Boston. Understand, Massachusetts, we talked about this, is founded by these guys who come over with this, they're religious dissenters, because the Puritans are also political dissenters. They want to reform the Church of England, which is to say change the nature of the government in England, really. So the British government is already suspicious of these guys. They don't like them. They kicked them out of England, and now they're causing the same problems in America they caused back in England. So to stifle this, they send all these soldiers over to Boston. Please understand this about these soldiers. Wellington, a generation later, Duke of Wellington, referred to the British Army as the scum of the earth. Those were his own men. We're way before you joined the army for patriotism and freedom and all that stuff. At this point in history, you join the army because you really just have no other options in life. If you have no other options in life, it's really not bad. The pay is decent, it's something. Please understand this too. I use the phrase British Army, English Army kind of interchangeably. Technically, it's the King's Army, not the country's army. That can sound like just a hair-splitting distinction. It's not. The King of England, remember also he's the King of Hanover. If somebody does something to Hanover, or if he decides he wants to send these guys off to fight in Europe, off they go. They're his army to do with what he wants. Or has to ask for Parliament for money to fund them, but they're his. It's very different than what you're going to see later on with these nationalist armies. We're going to see, talk about French Revolution and stuff like that. So, you send over a few thousand kind of very, very rough men, all young men. You dump them off in Boston. Of course, they're harassing the women, getting drunk, doing all kinds of stuff like that. But also, the British government, they don't pay these soldiers very much, but they allow them to work in their off hours part-time. So now you've got a few thousand young men in Boston who are taking all the day laborer jobs from the locals. If you can work for way less because the government's feeding and housing you, you can undercut the local workers. So they're intensely resented for that, apart from the fact they're here to enforce these hated taxes. Well, in March of 1770, soldier shows up in a bar, asks the bartender if he has any work. Bartender says, go clean my outhouse. There's a fight in the bar. Soldier goes back to the barracks, tells everybody what's happening. The officer in charge realizes now there's probably going to be some kind of riot. They're going to go down to the tax collector's house and destroy it. or the customs house. These guys, when these colonists riot and stuff, they'll go to the tax collector's house and tear it down brick by brick and light it on fire. So the soldiers post up in front of the customs house. Sure enough, an angry mob comes. Soldiers are there just against the wall. They don't really have clear orders or anything like that. They're getting pelted with snowballs. They're getting pelted with rocks. Eventually, one guy gets hit with a rock. His musket goes off. The rest of them take that as their cue to fire, so they just open fire into the crowd. 5 people die. The crowd's dispersed. But later on, 8 of those soldiers are arrested. Now, they get arrested, and who shows up to defend them? Guy we haven't talked about yet, John Adams. John Adams, one of those founding fathers, a lawyer from Massachusetts, Harvard-educated guy, came from a farming family. We're going to hear a lot more about him, of course, because he rolls into the Declaration of Independence and becomes second president and everything like that. But at this stage in his life, he's a lawyer, and he works to defend these British soldiers accused of killing Bostonians. And that might seem odd, because we know that John Adams is very much against all these taxes, very much against all the British policies, very much against these soldiers being there in the first place. It's important to understand John Adams, like most of the founding fathers, believes that anarchy is worse than tyranny. British army is bad, that's oppression. But mobs in the streets burning and looting and pillaging and attacking people, that's worse. John Adams defends these soldiers. As you can see, 6 were fully acquitted, 2 received light sentences, thanks to John Adams. Now you look at this cartoon. This can tell you a lot. This is a cartoon from a newspaper by Paul Revere. Back in elementary school and in older times, you would learn Paul Revere's Midnight Ride and all this stuff, and they don't do that anymore, but it used to be great. Anyway, Paul Revere, silversmith, cartoonist, journalist, all kinds of things, created this cartoon, and I don't know how clearly you can see it. Remember, all these PowerPoint slides, remember, are going to be at the end of this video. So if you skip ahead to the end, you'll see just a sequence of these. You can pause it and read it all you want. In this cartoon, you got a moon up here, which indicates that it's night. But of course, it's very bright, and you just kind of get the impression that it's in broad daylight. Really, it took place at night. Here you have a crowd of people, and they're facing forward as if they're coming towards you walking down the street. Here are the British soldiers. They're not a confused group of frightened young men. They're lined up in combat formation. And as you can see, the officer here, he has his sword up, meant to indicate that he's giving the order to fire, which, of course, there was no order. So it looks as if the soldiers just opened fire on this peaceful group of people walking down the street. I don't know what the significance of the dog is, but there he is. This is not how this happened, but this is how the story gets out in the colonies. There are people who really want to fan the flames of anger against the British government. Paul Revere is one of them. But there are others. People like John Adams' cousin, Sam Adams. Now, you guys don't know anything about alcohol, obviously, and you probably haven't heard of this stuff called beer, but there's this stuff called beer, and there's a beer company called Sam Adams. And you see the bottle of Sam Adams, maybe you've seen it somewhere. I hope not, because you're young. Bottle of Sam Adams, it's got Sam Adams in the front, brewer, patriot, all that. There was a Sam Adams, and he was a brewer for a brief time. He failed at it. Sam Adams, unlike the successful and respectable John Adams, fails at just about everything he tries. Just fails and fails and fails. He's a type that we will see over and over again in American history. This angry loser, basically, just fails at everything, except he finds out he's good at one particular thing: causing trouble. In peaceful, orderly times, this guy would have no place. When things are kind of chaotic and nobody knows what's going to happen and there's tension and all this troublemaker can just rise up and really find his voice. We're going to see this again with Thomas Paine. So Sam Adams is really good at causing trouble, and causing trouble is what he does. He's radical, way off on the edge, earlier than most people, calling for independence. And Sam Adams is associated with something called the Sons of Liberty. I say associated because the exact nature of it, it's controversial, whatever. Sam Adams is associated with something called the Sons of Liberty. Sons of Liberty are not a group. They're not an organization of people, top-down hierarchy, all that. Sons of Liberty is a collective term for a whole bunch of organizations all over the colonies. And basically these are patriotic thug squads. They're the ones leading the attacks on the tax collectors, burning down people's houses, beating people up, all that. They're thug squads, essentially. And these guys, in this chaos, in these troubles that are happening, they're the ones who are really pushing the pace in terms of violence and protest. Now we get to the British East India Company. When you're rich, you got a business and stuff like that, and you work hard, you make a bunch of bad decisions, you fail, you go broke. That's just capitalism. That's how things work. I'm just kidding, of course. That's not how things work at all. If you're very, very rich and you fail, the government just bails you out. You're too big to fail. That's what happened to all these companies. That during 2008 they lost all their money in horrible investments. No problem. They're all still there. Bailed them out. They're too big to fail. Well, that's kind of what happens with this company called the British East India Company. British East India Company is one of those chartered joint stock type deals. It's a public-private partnership. And the British East India Company has all these tea plantations in India. Unfortunately for the British East India Company, they've made some bad investments, and they need to recoup some money really quickly. So they go to the British government. The British government says, no problem, you're too big to fail. We'll help you out. So the British government basically slaps a tariff on all tea in the New World apart from the British East India Company's tea. So in other words, let's say you got Dutch tea, it's $8 a pound, and British East India Company tea is $10 a pound. So you're going to buy the Dutch tea, right? But if you slap a $4 a pound tax on that, the Dutch tea is now $12, and the British East India Company tea, even though it's just as expensive as it was, is now the cheapest option. Well, the people, and there's all kinds of laws that come along with this. The British government thinks this will help the British East India Company, but of course, like all these other taxes, everything else they've done, it completely backfires. It makes the colonies furious. The tensions are already high. If this was the first thing they'd ever done before that Sugar Act, who knows, it might have worked. When the tensions are this high, though, it doesn't. Sons of Liberty dress themselves like Mohawk Indians. They burn cork, smear on their faces. And all this. I don't know who they were trying to fool, but everybody knew it was them. They attack one of these British East India Company cargo ships at night. I don't say attack, like they fought people. They just basically broke in. They break into the cargo hold, get all the chests of tea out of there, the crushed tea and everything, and they throw it over into Boston Harbor. This is not just some symbolic thing. They destroy millions of dollars worth of property by throwing it, modern money, millions of dollars worth of property, throw it in the water, and it's a mass act of pointless, violent vandalism. At this stage, the British government has now become furious. As a result of the Boston Tea Party, the British government passes laws that become known as the Intolerable Acts. Technically, there's 5 of these. I put 4. The Quebec Act is in there. I didn't mention the Quebec Act up here, but it's something else. Don't worry about Quebec. Don't worry about the Quebec Act. They passed 4 new laws, the Intolerable Acts, as they're called in America. We are done playing around, say the British government. We have toyed with these colonists for long enough. It is time once and for all to assert our authority. So, first, Boston legislature is shut down. People of Boston will no longer pass their own laws. Second, Boston Harbor is out of use. We are basically shutting down Boston Harbor until the merchants of Boston cough up money to pay for all this tea that was destroyed. Third, we're sending an army over, and you guys have to quarter them in your homes, basically free of charge. And last, any British government official who causes problems in the colonies will now be tried not in the colonies, but back in Britain. So in other words, if you're a tax collector and you hire your own thug squad to beat up the thug squads who are coming after you, and the local people arrest you, they have to send you back to England for trial, where of course you'll probably just be acquitted right away. Now, I want you to look at this. This is another one of these cartoons. It's put out by an American cartoonist. And look at what's going on here. Here are some rich merchants, presumably East India Company merchants, somebody like that. And here's the British government, and here are the colonies. They're forcing tea down her throat, but if you look, her dress has been torn off. This guy's holding her arms back. This guy's lifting up her skirts. There's very much this idea of sexual assault America is being sexually assaulted by the British government. And this is designed to evoke a very visceral reaction in the minds of the male readers. There's something deep down in a man. This guy's messing with your women. And it just provokes this incredibly angry emotional response. That's really what this cartoonist is going for. Here you see Liberty, just turning her head away in shame at this horrible spectacle. The rhetoric, as you can see, is very overheated. People are fanning the flames on both sides. Parliament really wants to shut down all this protest and everything, remind these people that they are subordinate. Whereas patriots in the colonies, especially radical people who are already calling for independence, are putting out inflammatory things like this. The thing about the Boston legislature, though, it doesn't go away. It just moves down the road and sets up shop and calls out the militia. Now things have gone from bad to worse. Oh, I don't know how I didn't mention this. Those committees of correspondence evolved into the Continental Congress. The representatives from all these colonies, there's two. Okay, I'm making this sound much simpler than it actually is. There's actually two Continental Congresses. There's a first Continental Congress and a second Continental Congress. I just lumped them together as a term because it's easier to remember, and we got 20 terms, and just bear that in mind. But understand, Continental Congress is an organization made up of delegates from each of the colonies, from Massachusetts all the way down to Georgia eventually. And these guys all get together to debate how they're going to respond to this basic provocation. Britain has shut down Massachusetts Bay, shut down the legislature, all that. While this is going on, Massachusetts legislature calls up the militia. Continental Congress is debating what to do next. But the next move really is Britain's move. The British government is aware Massachusetts legislature has not stopped operating. It's just moved down the road, basically. They're aware that they've called out the militia. The commander in charge in Boston, a guy named Thomas Gage, he's trying to figure out what to do about this and everything. Understand, bear in mind how slowly news travels. We're talking about going back and forth from England to America to get orders and things like that. That can take 2 months. So this is, you really got to kind of think on your feet when you're a commander in America. Just anticipate what they're going to want you to do back home. So Thomas Gage says, all right, we know these guys are out here, the militia's drilling and stuff like that. And we've gotten word that they've got ammo dumps. In other words, they've stockpiled muskets, musket balls, gunpowder, all that stuff. In two little small towns called Lexington and Concord. So, here's what we should do. Let's march out, not tell anybody we're coming, just a relatively small group of guys, a couple hundred guys, march out, seize all the weapons in Lexington, seize all the weapons in Concord, and then march back. And once they don't have any weapons and ammo and all that, they'll sober up and go home. It's kind of the idea. Diffuse the situation. And again, I'm making things simpler than they actually were, just so we get a general understanding of what's happening here. So, Thomas Gage sends out these soldiers to march over to Lexington and Concord and get all this stuff. Here's the problem. Everybody out here knows these guys are coming. Of course, they have spies and informers in the city. They know what Gage is up to. And so they're ready for it. Well, group of militia come out. Gage's men come out. Militia forms up, blocking their way. Somebody fires first. It's not clear who, but the militia disperses. These are full-time professional British soldiers versus rabble of farmers, essentially, at this point. The militia disperses, and the British soldiers march on, thinking, okay, great, well, that's all the resistance they're going to offer. What they don't realize is these guys, they've dispersed, but they haven't gone away. They're forming up here and there, all around them and behind them. And more people are coming. The famous Minutemen, the Massachusetts militia, were supposed to be ready to go on a minute's notice. All these farmers hear word there's been shooting. They kiss their wives goodbye, pick up their muskets, and run out. And they find the British soldiers, and they hide behind houses and trees and just start shooting at them. So the British soldiers are taking fire from the woods and farms all around them. They make it to Lexington, and they find that, of course, all of these guns and everything, if they ever were there, have been moved somewhere else. At this point, they could try to go home, but they're thinking, we came out here, let's march on to Concord and see if they've moved anything from there too. So they march on, and as they're marching on, they're taking more and more fire. More and more people are coming out. They get to Concord, and everything's gone from Concord. And now look, they're all the way over here, and they have to march back. And they march back through this gauntlet of gunfire coming at them from behind all these different obstacles. Boom, boom, boom. You can't see these guys. Your men are dropping around you. The soldiers get furious. They torch farmhouses. They shoot livestock, everything they can. And they finally make their way back to Boston. And once the remnants of them make their way back to Boston, Thomas Gage sends word back to England, we are now facing an insurrection. And he calls for more men, and the Revolutionary War at this point essentially has begun. Next time we meet, I got through this really quickly. I was purposely trying to go through it as fast as I could because I know the other ones I've done, I kind of went in little tangents and everything like that, and ended up being like 57 minutes, and you couldn't watch the whole thing in class. So I really tried to get through this fast. This is actually only it'll probably end up being about 40 minutes long as opposed to the 57 minutes. I can't promise you they'll all be really short, because, again, it's a 9-year period, so. I can't promise you they'll all be this short, but I'm trying to, I really do I think about how long you have to watch this, and I try to squeeze it in as much as I can. Alright. Cover everything? Good? Okay, good. Alright, so, next time we meet, next time I see you, we will talk about, well, next time I do a video, I should say, we'll talk about the Revolutionary War. We'll go through that. That probably won't be a short one. And I hope to come down sometime this month. I know for a fact I'll be down at least once this month. And I look forward to seeing you all again. And so thank you for watching. Thank you for doing such a good job so far. Thank you, students, and thank you, Ms. Hahn and Ms. McCall, for facilitating all of this. On behalf of Great Collegiate Academy, I'll see you later.